In this video, you will learn about the details surrounding the buying or selling of a home that has been stigmatized. While the video itself is a training session for realtors, it will also be very educational for consumers alike. Hi, my name is Kevin Flaherty. I'm an Icon real estate broker with eXp Realty, and I have 3 decades of experience. I currently run a real estate team and host a group of realtors where we share cutting-edge tools, strategies, and best practices. Just before we get into the video, a quick disclaimer: I'm not an attorney, and this video should not be taken as legal advice. Now that we've got that out of the way, enjoy the video.
You guys, a stigma is, and don't quote me on definitions and stuff like that, but it's something that could possibly cause an emotional response on the part of a buyer. And you'll note that I didn't say a justified emotional response on the part of a buyer, right? Because it simply may not be. Like, what might be completely illogical to me, someone thinks a house is haunted, right? Which would be kind of absurd to me, may not be absurd to that person. Something that might not be a big deal to one person may invoke a very emotional response in another. So it's something that could invoke an emotional response on the part of the buyer. Now, I have to try and get my head here again. We have a couple of challenges with stigmas. The first thing is there is no case law out there right now to support that a seller would have to disclose a stigma. Yeah. There's no case law out there, or even suggestion to us. I pulled up Rico's bulletin. It's a dated bulletin. We had kind of some questions surrounding this in how to handle it recently. Like, normally we don't run into this stuff, but this is going to prepare you. I've created a couple of documents as well. Could you run into Slack and type in stigma and pull up some stuff that we've prepared to help people deal with this. So if you run into a stigmatized property, and you have to first understand that the seller can direct you not to disclose a stigma. Yeah. Not to be confused with sheer facts regarding the property that deficiencies in the property. You cannot get these things confused. You know, the property was a grow lab. The property had a leak. The property has, structural problems. Please don't ever confuse anything that I'm about to say with a stigma, which could be someone was murdered in the house. What about somebody just died in the house? It wasn't an act, an aggressive act. What if they just simply died in the house? Like, that could be a stigma. It gets complicated because there are lots of houses out there that people have died in. Like, most of them, right? Like, if you go into Brampton, the older parts of Brampton, I think you'd have a harder time finding one where someone hasn't died than did. What if you get a house that was built in the 1800s? So now it comes down to the seller's knowledge, right? Did the seller know that a death occurred in the property? Right? They'd have to know about it before they could disclose it. Right? I had a 1902 home, and I didn't know that anybody died in that house. I bet you there was lots of people died in the house. But I didn't know of anything, so I didn't disclose any stigma. Yeah. Nor would there be a requirement for me to disclose that, even if I did know. So, a seller cannot, or we have to follow a seller's direction if he says you shall not disclose a stigma. So we have to provide the seller with some counsel regarding that. But it's more complicated than that. Because if you ever let a seller take the position, and I say if you let a seller take that position by not explaining everything to them about consequences. If a seller takes the position that they don't want to disclose a stigma, things get extra complicated now, because if you have knowledge and if you're in a dual agency, we shall disclose the stigma, whether the seller wants us to or not. And according to a RICO bulletin, the suggestion is that we would allow them then the opportunity, even if they were under a buyer agency with us, they come to buy our own house, we would then afford them the opportunity to go to another agency to put in their offer. How would you like that to occur? You do a really great job, you find the buyer, the seller told you not to disclose a stigma, you know about the stigma, now that you're in a dual agency, it's incumbent upon you to disclose the stigma, whether the seller wants you to or not. And when you disclose the stigma, sorry, I jumped the gun. Back up just a couple minutes. Seller tells you not to disclose the stigma. Since it's incumbent upon you to disclose everything you know, now you need to direct them to another agency to put in the offer. So watch this. If an agent, another agency, asks you about a stigma, if another agency asks you about a stigma, and the seller directed you not to disclose it, you cannot say there is not a stigma. And you can't disclose it. You have to say, sorry, I can't answer that question. You can't lie and say there's no stigma. You can't imply there's no stigma. You can't suggest there's no stigma. You have to basically say, yeah, good question. Sorry, I can't answer it. Right? So you have to be perfectly honest. If you can't, the seller can't direct you to lie, and now you lie. No, there's no, was there ever a death in this property? There's a clause, comes in. Any stigma, you remove the clause. Why did you remove the clause? Sorry, I can't answer your question. What do you mean you can't answer? I can't answer your question. Right? So that starts getting strange. So let's, so here I wrote down their definition according to RICO, and this is their bulletin. The stigma is a non-physical, tangible attribute of a property that may elicit a physiological or emotional response on the part of the potential buyer. Yeah. There's no legislation or case law in Ontario that suggests a seller or his representative is required to disclose the existence of a stigma. Internet search and also making a direct inquiries of the seller or registrant representative of the seller, include in any offers, representation or warranty regarding the status of the property. I'm reading you highlighted bits. Here's this part. I'll read the whole thing. All registrants have an obligation to act with fairness, honesty, and integrity when dealing with other real estate, when dealing in a real estate transaction. Similarly, registrants must use their best efforts to prevent error or misrepresentation while still promoting and protecting the best interests of their clients. Therefore, when the registrant representing the seller is asked about the existence of specific stigmas that might affect the property, the registrant may either answer the question based on the seller's directions and provide the information without qualification, or in the alternative, refuse to answer the question and suggest the buyer ascertain the answers for themselves. Wow. The approach to be taken should be based on detailed discussion and instructions from the seller. Registrants are expected to use reasonable care, skill to ensure accuracy and completeness of the information conveyed to the buyer and or his representative, and should consider documenting such responses. We have considered documenting such responses, and even if they said don't document such responses, we would, because what does sellers say 2 months down the road? You didn't tell me that. That's not the conversation we had. And who's always the bad guy? Yeah, we're always the bad guy, not the member of the public. right? So we better be able to prove it. Registrants representing the seller should have a full and frank discussion with the seller regarding the stigma. If it is determined that there may be stigmatizing issues associated with the property, the registrant should advise the seller to seek legal advice regarding their rights and obligations related to the issue and get written instructions regarding the disclosure of the stigmas. In multiple representation scenarios, the issue becomes more complicated. Before a seller is asked to consent to multiple representation, it is explained that any information about a stigma will have to be conveyed to the buyer as part of the brokerage's duty to the buyer. If the seller objects to that, so you're going to have to explain that if I have my own person, I have to disclose it. And if you can't get an exception to that disclosure for your own clients, then, well, in their words, if the seller objects to this, they should be advised that they do not have to consent to multiple representation. If the consent is not given, the registrant must inform the buyer of this fact, and the brokerage will have to release the buyer to seek alternative representation. Wow. So we had an issue regarding a stigma. It's fairly mild, but basically in order to deal this in a way that is directed to us by the registrar, we've created a document. We explained what a stigma is. Further to our conversation with your representative, it has been determined that the sale of your property will be subject to a stigma, definition of a stigma, and then there is no legal or case law in Ontario to suggest that the seller or his representative, when not acting under the dual agency, is required to disclose the existence of the stigma. However, failure to disclose same could result in legal action against the seller. The seller acknowledges that their representative have made them aware of this fact and has recommended to the seller to seek legal action. So those were all requirements. And did you notice in there, we slipped in when not acting under dual agency is required to disclose. Option A, please disclose the stigma to any potential buyers. You want them answering that way. You really want them acknowledging option A, or things are going to get really weird and complicated for you. And by the way, they can come back on you too. We know there's a realtor in town, the Stigmatized property. You guys know who we're talking about? It was front page news, and that realtor got taken out. So it was a lady, a domestic, I think she was killed on the porch of the property. It wasn't even in the house. It was like outside the house, at the front of the house, and it wasn't disclosed. They destroyed him in the media for not disclosing it. So even if, so we'd have to have this to protect ourselves, and we'd have to, you know, hopefully we'll never be there. We want to disclose this stuff. However, option B, please do not discuss the stigma with potential buyers. In the event that IPR Realty obtains a buyer and is acting under a dual agency, I would prefer the stigma is disclosed to potential buyer only under these circumstances. The buyer put in his offer through a different agency and the stigma is not disclosed. There's their options. We're gonna have to work on your sales skills if you ever have somebody sign that. That'll be a bad one. We made this ourselves because there is no direction in it, but this complies with the Registrar's Bulletin and is how it's in writing. The facts are disclosed. Did we tell them to seek legal counsel, which they'll say we didn't do, right? Yep. He signed off saying, we told you to go seek legal counsel. What's legal counsel going to tell them? Disclose. Clause for use when representing the buyer. Seller represents and warrants to the best of the seller's knowledge and belief that the subject property has not been involved with circumstances that may elicit a negative or psychological or emotional response on the part of the buyer, including not limited to deaths, suicides, murders on the property. This warranty shall survive not merge upon completion of the transaction. By the way, that's not a clause. there is no clause for a stigma. But what did it say in the bulletin put out by RICO when representing a buyer? When representing a buyer, it is the obligation of the registrant to use their best efforts to identify properties that meet the buyer's criteria to generally promote and protect the interests of the buyer. They're using the word obligation. Accordingly, the registrant representative, a buyer, must obtain as much information as possible from them before beginning the process of searching for a suitable property and representing them with third parties. Registrants must disclose in detail the buyer's needs and wants regarding property requirements, including constraints or restrictions, and any other issues or concerns the buyer may have with respect to the purchase of a property. Okay. So you ask about it when you're talking to them. Do you have any concerns? Is there any properties that you don't want? Do you want properties with aluminum wiring? Do you want properties with asbestos insulation? Are you okay with that? Like, I think it's pretty challenging to have a conversation about every possible thing a buyer may or may not want. Take asbestos. Now, how long could you speak about asbestos being, like, I could talk to you about it for a day, pretty sure, about asbestos in real estate. Now you're expected to summarize that. Aluminum wiring, expected to summarize that. What about galvanized plumbing? Do you want to with that? What about a death on a property? Would that be an issue? I mean, you can ask on the surface and get general ideas, but to try and suggest that you're going to have a conversation regarding everything that could possibly come up is a little absurd. Communication is a two-way street, of course, so they say this. And RICO encourages buyers to be proactive and provide information to the representative and ask questions regarding the issue of specific importance to them and their families. So that's a general question. They're suggesting that. Nonetheless, registrars are encouraged to communicate extensively and frequently with their buyers to best understand their wants, needs, priorities, and concerns. For the purpose of consistency and record keeping, a registrant should consider documenting their inquiries through the use of a questionnaire or similar tools. So now they're thinking we should come up with a great, how many realtors are going to come up with a great big questionnaire about every topic? It could be like, I mean, it's kind of a little silly. So just in case, like, I mean, even in the stigma, would you want a property that might have been, a drug lab, even if it was remediated? Would you want, what if it was a chop shop? What if sometime in the past it was a brothel? What if there was a murder on the property? What if there was a suicide on the property? What if there was a death on the property? What if it was a natural death on the property? Like, I mean, it gets, like, really, I'm supposed to extract all this information?
What if there's a pet buried in the yard?
Yeah, what if there's a pet buried in the yard? Could listed emotional response, right? What if it was owned by someone who had a criminal offense? I mean, what if it's haunted? I mean, where does this conversation, and how would you ever prepare such a document that would cover everything, right? So the relevance and impact of a potential stigma or other such physical circumstances will be determined by the buyer's personal values and perceptions, ethnic background, religion, gender, age, and other individual concerns. Given all possible circumstances that might exist for a buyer to consider a property to be stigmatized, it is impossible for registrants to determine in advance what these might be. They're saying you should have a questionnaire, and they're saying in the next breath, it's impossible for you to determine what these might be. I'm not making this up. This is right from the registrar. Like, we've run into these challenges before, like lockboxes. Thou shalt never, bold, underlined, ever release a lockbox code to a non-registrant, bolded out and underlined. We refused to give it to the seller. and all the arguments that come with not giving it to the seller. And we got a complaint, and they drilled us with questions as to why. And by the way, we went to Rico and asked for clarification on their bulletin. They come back and gave us an answer consistent with we can't say. And then we still come back and attack this after a complaint. And we even asked for clarification. Anyways, that's what it's fun dealing with this stuff. So what do we have to do then? What's the final answer when representing someone on the purchase of property? In my respectful opinion, it is not come up with a questionnaire, which is impossible, which they say is also impossible. It would be there only one way we could protect. Well, two. We query the property, and you should. You should do an internet query on any house you're offering on. You should do your due diligence and know the area. If you're in a town you don't know, you better learn what issues. There might be a bypass going by there that's been proposed, and it looks like a farmer's field right now. It is, I don't think it's news to you guys that it's incumbent upon you, if you're representing a buyer, to do your due diligence, bring yourself up to speed with the area. And while an internet search isn't going to query anything about that property, if the buyer's representative had searched that address, I bet something would have come up in the news about that murder. Right? Something may come up regarding that address. It may not, but at least you checked. So then, other than running an internet check, which really isn't going to tell you, I mean, it's just an obvious on the surface, something really bad happened at this house. Who knows where the Bernardo home is?
St. Catherine's. Isn't it gone?
I don't know. Did they
It's
just
been
tear it down?
demolished. Been demolished, yeah.
Is it?
57 Bayview Avenue.
Yeah, I think that's pretty extreme. But the point is, I'm pretty sure if you did an internet query, that would have come up if it had still existed. Right? There might be things there on the internet. I doubt you're gonna. It's a very surface check. It's not going to go very deep. So then, if we're representing buyers based on what we're being told here, the best way, in my respectful opinion, is to write this clause into your offers. And if they stroke it out, recognize that they watch the words. If they say, sorry, I can't answer the question, you know there's a stigma. And then you disclose that. There's a stigma that I've checked the address. I don't really know what it is, but they stroked out that clause. Clearly there's a stigma.
So I have a question. So if they cross that out and you suspect that there is a stigma, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you disclose that to your buyer who you are representing in this case,
Mhm.
how do you put that in writing? Because you might be told, you never told me that.
Yeah, well, I'd just send them a text or an email just saying, just so you know, we had a conversation regarding this being stroked out. But bottom line is, if he strokes that out, if you put something in an offer and something comes out, it stands to reason that you had a conversation about it. If you put it in an offer and he stroked it out, he has to initial off that it's out. That in itself protects you, right? You knew they took this clause out, you signed off on it. Now you're saying you've got a problem with the stigma. I think that'd be an uphill battle, right? In fact, I probably wouldn't even worry about sending it to him by email or text. If he strokes that out, you just said you're not concerned about stigma issues. You stroked it out. If it was never in there to begin with and a stigma comes up and the seller's not obligated to disclose it to you and you never asked the question, where are you then? Now, here's something I want to point out. I want to make this bit clear. You guys are independent contractors. It is not mandatory for you to put this clause into your offers. It is not mandatory for you to put your clause in, this clause into all offers. But if you don't, and I may elect not to in certain cases, but if you don't, you'll wear it if something goes wrong. See, I like probabilities. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never gotten involved or stepped into a pile of shit because of a stigma regarding a property. But the point is you could. So if you elect not to, and you get in shit, you had the tools and you had the training on this day that told you how to stay out of it. Because here's what I think. Does anybody see, if we were to tackle the issue of stigma, does anybody see any reasonable way to determine if there's a stigma without the use of this clause?
Asking, even doing the neighborhood, kind of walking around
It's
and asking.
literally
neighbors.
impossible, right?
Yeah.
Like,
But usually the neighbors are the ones spilling out after the house is
right.
purchased. Oh,
All right.
you know that.
Is it reasonable for you, if you weren't going to have this clause, to document a conversation and for you to try and think up everything that might cause an emotional reaction to a buyer? Are you going to want to have that conversation? Hey, listen, I just got to talk to you for the next few hours about all kinds of shit. I'm going to start off with deaths, all the various deaths. Could be a natural death. Now, natural death breaks into some different areas. It could be an old person that died naturally, but what if it was a young baby that died naturally? I need to figure out what might elicit an emotional response from you. So we're going to kind of look at every angle and everything we can possibly think of.
Oh, just
Right? So they say you should do that. They even suggest a form of questions and then say it's not possible. It's like, oh my God. Ombudsman, did you say? Because they can do no wrong, right? They provide a bunch of vague information so that they can attack you on it if something goes wrong. That's what this is. Because they're a consumer protection agency, they write their directives so that they can attack us regardless of what we do, we're screwed. So, in recognizing that, because I've dealt with it, and recognizing in this document, this is just like, here we go again, right? The only thing we can do to guarantee that you never get in trouble with a stigma is that document, or on a buyer, that clause. Now, here's why I say it's not mandatory, and I gave this a lot of thought. One, the odds. What are the odds of you getting in trouble on this? Pretty low. Could it happen? Yes. But what are the odds? What are the odds in bumping into a realtor that has no idea what they're doing? They don't like the wording of that clause and they stroke it out and there is no stigma. High. I think those are high, right? Can we word that clause in any other way? That's as light as I can make it. Like, I tried to say and suggest, including not limited to death, suicide, murder on the property. So they'll just go, oh, this means is there somebody that died on the property? But it can mean so much more than that. But if you wrote it in and you're dealing with a numpty realtor and he just strokes it out for the fun of it because he doesn't understand it or why it might exist, now you have no choice but to say to your buyer, any reasonable, prudent, and cautious person under these circumstances would conclude there is a stigma on this property, but I can't prove it one way or another. A stigma could include all these things. Are you good with the property? And now you screwed your own deal.
and the buyer.
All because some realtor just stroked out a clause because they didn't like it. Does that happen? Do realtors do things that are not logical? So I think that's much more likely to occur. And for those reasons, it's not mandatory, but it is up to you. But if you don't, and something happens, of course you have to wear it.
It's a good practice.
Until one day you have some numpty realtor. I hate to say it, but it could be an assessment of the realtor you're dealing with.
Yeah.
You might go, hey, just so you know, stigmas are kind of a sensitive issue these days in real estate. I don't know if you've had any dealings with them, but our brokerage has had a number of cases regarding stigmas. Would you have any objection to me putting in a stigma clause? Right? You could do that and then put it in. Right? You could ask him, hey, do you know of any stigmas? See how he answers. No, there's no stigmas on the property. Well, that just says he doesn't know what he's, right? None that I'm aware of. Okay. You could feel it out, but you may or may not get the opportunities to do that. You may be in a super sensitive situation. What if you're in multiple offers? Now you might use a text message saying to the seller, I normally put in a stigmatized clause, deaths, murders, suicides. But if we put it in and there's 10 offers on this property, you want to make things as clean as you possibly can. I don't want to mess anything up for you. If there was a death on the property or some other stigma, would that matter? No. Respond to this text, and of course it's all through sync, right? You've directed me not to put in a clause regarding potential stigmas on the property in order to keep your offer clean, which would improve the chances of you getting the house in these circumstances. I've explained stigma to you and suggested you seek legal advice on this point. Respond to that saying you got it. Great. Now it's recorded. You could do that with your buyer in a sensitive issue. But to just go, for me to go, you should put that in every time? No, I wouldn't. I would decide when I'm going to put it in. You could, even things like the house is 1802 versus the house was built last year. Now, still could have been a death, there still could have been something happen, but which is more relevant? So I'm going to let you assess the circumstances and decide when you want to use it. That's for buyers, that's for sellers. Any questions on stigmatizing issues?